Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the story of Falun Gong, which is also known as Falun Dafa.
Yes, and we've got a fascinating collection of sources here. They really map out the whole trajectory of this spiritual practice.
Exactly. We'll be looking at, how it started, its core beliefs, how it just exploded in popularity in China.
And then, of course, the major clash with the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP.
Right. And from there, the crackdown, the ban, these very serious human rights violation claims.
The international reaction, how the group operates now in exile.
Plus some of the controversies surrounding it and kind of where things stand today, its legacy.
So for you, the learner, our aim here is to figure out how this seemingly non-political spiritual group ended up in such direct conflict with the Chinese state.
And how that grew into this global human rights conversation.
Exactly. We'll sift through the key moments and beliefs to try and grasp the core of what is, well, a pretty complex story.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. It kicked off in 1992.
That's right. Founded by Li Hongzhi in Changchun, China. It was 1992.
And this was during that period in China after Mao where there was a sort of spiritual searching going on.
Precisely. A kind of spiritual awakening, or at least a quest for meaning. Falun Gong emerged right in that context.
So what was it offering? What were the main ingredients, so to speak?
Well, it blended traditional Chinese Qigong, those energy cultivation exercises, and meditation,
Right, I've heard of Qigong.
with Buddhist ideas,
Mm-hmm.
especially compassion, and some Taoist principles. But Li Hongzhi also added his own distinct metaphysical teachings.
Okay, and the core principles.
At the very heart are three principles: Zen, Shan, Ren, truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance.
Zen, Shan, Ren.
Li taught these weren't just, good moral guidelines, but fundamental cosmic laws, universal principles.
So much more than just physical exercise then.
Definitely. While lots of Qigong focused on health, Falun Gong really emphasized the spiritual and moral side.
And it stood out in other ways too.
Yes, importantly, it rejected commercialization. No fees, no formal memberships, no political agenda stated up front.
Which was different from some other Qigong groups at the time.
Quite different, yeah. The focus was meant to be purely on self-cultivation, mind and body. The promise was enlightenment and cleansing your karma.
And people responded to this.
Massively. Li's lectures attracted huge crowds all over China. His teachings were put into books like Falun Gong and the main text, Swan Falun.
Right.
It spread incredibly fast, mostly just by word of mouth and people seeing these groups doing exercises together in parks.
So initially, very personal, very spiritual, not political at all.
That's how it started, yes.
Yeah.
A system for self-betterment seemed apolitical.
But that perception changed later on.
It did. In a state like China, even something spiritually neutral, if it grows large enough and is independent, can eventually be seen as subversive, a potential threat.
That's a key point. Okay, so we have the origins. Let's dig into those core beliefs a bit more. Truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, the absolute foundation.
Absolutely fundamental. Zen, Shan, Ren, they're seen as cosmic laws.
Cosmic laws, wow.
Yeah, so practitioners try to align their thoughts, their words, their actions with these principles constantly
And the goal is?
to purify your heart, essentially,
Yeah.
and reduce your karma.
Karma. Now, in this context, is that just like good deeds versus bad deeds?
It's a bit more profound than that in their view. Karma is seen as the spiritual root of suffering and hardship. Bad karma keeps you stuck
Stuck how?
in the cycle of suffering, reincarnation, that sort of thing. So eliminating bad karma is key.
How do you do that?
Through discipline, moral improvement, and even enduring hardship. That's considered crucial for reaching enlightenment. It's like a spiritual cause and effect.
Okay, I think I follow. And the exercises fit into this.
Yes, there are 4 standing exercises and 1 seated meditation. They look a bit like Qigong,
Right.
but the purpose in Falun Gong is explicitly to work with internal energy, transform the body,
Yeah.
elevate it spiritually. It's tied directly to the cultivation process.
Okay. Now, you mentioned something controversial earlier about medicine.
Ah, yes, that's a big one. Part of the practice emphasizes detachment from worldly things, fame, money, emotions.
Standard enough for spiritual paths, maybe?
True, but it extends to sometimes questioning reliance on modern medicine. The belief is that illness often comes from karmic issues.
So spiritual practice can heal you instead.
That's the idea, that cultivation can resolve the root cause, potentially making medical treatment less necessary. This has, understandably, drawn a lot of criticism from doctors and health experts.
I can imagine. And how is Li Hongji himself viewed by practitioners? Just a teacher.
Oh, much more than that. He's seen as a truly enlightened being, offering salvation in what they see as an age of moral decline.
So a figure of immense importance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
His writings, especially his Falun, are treated as sacred texts. Deviating isn't just disagreeing, it's a spiritual mistake.
That's serious dedication. And how was it all structured? Was there a main office, a hierarchy?
Actually, no. It was remarkably decentralized. People just formed small local study groups. They'd read Lee's works together, do the exercises in parks.
No formal membership lists or anything?
Not really. Which ironically helped it spread so fast under the radar and later made it harder for the government to initially get a handle on.
That decentralization plus the message,
Yeah.
it led to that incredible growth in the 90s. We're talking millions, right? Tens of millions.
Just staggering numbers. Within 7 years, by 1999, the Chinese government's own estimate was up to 70 million practitioners.
70 million. Wow.
Yeah. Independent sources varied, some higher, some a bit lower, maybe 30 million, but even the low end is huge. It became this massive national phenomenon.
What fueled that? Why so popular so quickly?
Well, you had that spiritual vacuum we mentioned. Decades of upheaval had eroded traditional beliefs. People were looking for something.
And Falun Gong offered.
A clear moral code, a path to spiritual meaning, better health potentially, and it was accessible, non-bureaucratic. Just show up in the park. It hit a nerve.
Was it specific to any group? Educated people, rural people.
That's the fascinating thing. It cut across all lines. Urban, rural, highly educated professors, factory workers.
Really?
Even party members and military folks.
Mm.
Lots of them. People gathered for exercises, formed study groups, tried to live by Zen, Shan, Ren.
And the government's initial take? They were okay with it.
For a while, yes.
Yeah.
Tolerated, maybe even quietly encouraged for the health benefits and promoting, good citizenship.
But the sheer numbers became a problem.
Exactly. By the late 90s, it was arguably the largest voluntary association in China, totally independent of the party. That scale started to really alarm the authorities.
Alarm them how? As competition.
As potential ideological competition, yes.
Yeah.
Something huge that they didn't control. That's where the seeds of conflict were sown.
Which leads us to that huge event in April 1999, the gathering near Zhongnanhai. What happened there?
That was absolutely pivotal. April 25th, 1999. Over 10,000 Falun Gong practitioners gathered, silently.
10,000. Where exactly?
Right near Zhongnanhai, which is the central leadership compound in Beijing, like gathering outside the White House, essentially.
What were they asking for?
They were petitioning. They wanted the government to stop negative state media reports about them and grant them legal recognition and protection to practice freely.
A silent protest of that size must have sent shockwaves.
It absolutely did. He was orderly, peaceful, no violence, but it was the biggest public gathering in Beijing since Tiananmen Square in '89.
And completely organized outside the party structure.
That was the key thing. The leadership, especially then President Jiang Zemin, reportedly saw it as a direct challenge, an affront to the party's absolute authority.
They feared a rival power base.
Precisely. The idea that such a large group could mobilize so effectively, completely independently, that was terrifying to them.
And Falun Gong's core values, truthfulness, compassion, forbearance.
Were seen as fundamentally at odds with Marxist materialism and the party's demand for total loyalty. Independence was intolerable.
So the regime couldn't allow something outside its control to exist on that scale.
Exactly. Ecological conformity is paramount. This led directly to the propaganda onslaught.
Right, the cults label.
Yes, a massive campaign labeling Falun Gong an evil cult, accusing it of brainwashing, causing deaths, disrupting society. Total demonization.
And then came the 610 office.
That's right. Jiang Zemin personally established it. A new, powerful, extra-legal party agency. Its sole purpose, to oversee the suppression of Falun Gong.
Extra legal meaning operating outside the normal legal system.
Basically, yes. With broad powers for surveillance, arrests, propaganda, forcing people into re-education, it answered only to the top party leadership.
So the crackdown wasn't about public safety, but ideological control.
Overwhelmingly, yes. Falun Gong hadn't called for overthrowing the government or used violence. It was about the party feeling threatened by an independent belief system.
And that led straight to the ban in July 1999. What did that look like on the ground?
It was swift and brutal. July 20th, 1999, the political ban came down. Immediately, mass arrests started across the country.
Just rounding people up.
Yes. Police raids, confiscating books and materials, often burning them publicly. The state media went into overdrive with nonstop negative coverage.
And the official justifications.
That Falun Gong promoted superstition, caused disorder, threatened party rule. basically painting it as an enemy of the state.
So it wasn't just illegal, it was targeted for elimination.
Complete eradication was the goal. The 610 office coordinated everything: police, schools, workplaces. If you practiced Falun Gong and refused to renounce it,
What happened?
detention, often without trial, intense thought reform sessions, essentially brainwashing, forced labor in camps, and widespread torture.
Horrific. And it affected whole families.
Absolutely. People lost jobs, kids were kicked out of school, families were pressured to turn against practitioners, loyalty to the party above all else.
Did the practitioners just accept this?
Many resisted, but almost entirely nonviolently. They kept practicing in secret. Some tried meditating in public, handing out leaflets explaining their side, petitioning.
But the state response was harsh.
They doubled down. Blacklists, more arrests, expanding the re-education through labor camps, tightening internet censorship to block any positive information.
It sounds like one of the biggest crackdowns since the Mao era.
It really was a huge campaign of ideological suppression. It revealed just how deeply the CCP feared any uncontrolled belief system.
And this is when it really became an international human rights crisis.
Exactly. The sheer scale and brutality of the persecution couldn't be hidden.
And the accounts of human rights violations since '99 are, well, they're deeply disturbing.
They truly are. The campaign has been marked by just systematic, severe abuses, hundreds of thousands, maybe more, detained without trial.
And inside detention.
Credible reports, documented by groups like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, detail horrific torture. Beatings, electric shocks, sleep deprivation, solitary confinement, all aimed at forcing people to give up their beliefs.
And deaths in custody.
Thousands of them documented, often attributed by authorities to suicide or illness, but without proper investigation. Families are often denied information or remains.
And then there are those absolutely shocking allegations about forced organ harvesting.
Yes, this is perhaps the most horrifying aspect. Several independent reports, like the Kilgore-Matas investigation and the China Tribunal.
What did they find?
They concluded there's substantial evidence that Falun Gong practitioners, while detained, have been killed on demand for their organs.
Killed for their organs? How could that even work?
The allegation is that prisoners of conscience, primarily Falun Gong, were tissue-typed, and when a matching transplant patient needed an organ, the prisoner would be executed and their organs harvested for sale.
That's almost unbelievable. Sold for profit.
Yes, fueling China's lucrative organ transplant industry. The incredibly short waiting times for transplants in China have long raised red flags internationally.
It sounds like something out of a nightmare. Has the international community responded to all this?
There has been widespread condemnation, yes. But the political responses from governments have been, well, mixed, often tempered by economic ties with China.
So lots of talk, but maybe less action.
Sometimes. Practitioners outside China have been incredibly active, though, protesting, lobbying governments, speaking at the UN, using media to get the word out.
Have governments done anything officially?
Yes. Parliaments in the US, Canada, the EU, and elsewhere have passed resolutions condemning the persecution. Some have called for sanctions on officials involved.
What about the UN?
UN special rapporteurs on torture and religious freedom have repeatedly raised concerns, including about organ harvesting. But getting access and cooperation from China is extremely difficult.
Have there been legal challenges?
Lawyers have tried bringing cases against Chinese officials in other countries under universal jurisdiction for torture and crimes against humanity. Limited success in getting trials, but it creates pressure.
And on a more public level, how have practitioners raised awareness?
Through constant grassroots efforts. Parades, art exhibits showing the persecution, film screenings, vigils outside embassies. Trying to break through the censorship online is also a huge focus.
But economic interests often get in the way of stronger action.
They're definitely a factor. Governments worry about trade retaliation. Big corporations are often silent too.
Still, they've managed to make it a global issue.
Absolutely. Falun Gong successfully internationalized their struggle. It's become a major point of discussion about human rights in China.
So, banned in China, but thriving, in a way, outside. How did it reorganize and operate in exile?
It really transformed. After the ban, practitioners who were already overseas or managed to escape formed new networks. Advocacy groups, practice sites, media platforms sprang up.
Especially in places like North America, Europe, Australia.
Exactly. The focus shifted heavily towards exposing the persecution back home and fighting the CCP's narrative. Counter-propaganda became key.
And they developed their own media outlet.
Yes, quite significant ones. The Epoch Times newspaper is probably the best known. It started specifically to cover the persecution. Now it's a large multi-language news outlet.
It has a reputation for being strongly anti-communist, right?
Very much so. And NTD-TV, New Tang Dynasty Television, and Sound of Hope Radio also emerged, often broadcasting into China, trying to bypass censorship.
And then there's Shenyun, the performing arts group.
Right. Shenyun is a huge part of their outreach. It presents traditional Chinese dance and music, aiming to revive pre-communist Chinese culture.
But it also includes pieces about Falun Gong.
Yes, explicitly.
Yeah.
Performances often depict scenes of the persecution and themes of spiritual redemption through Falun Dafa. It's cultural diplomacy mixed with advocacy.
So a multi-pronged approach. Media, culture, direct advocacy.
And continuing the core practices. Public meditation sessions, handing out flyers, petitions, social media campaigns, what they call truth clarification. It's very persistent.
Now, despite the sympathy many feel due to the persecution, Falun Gong isn't without its own controversies and criticisms, especially in the West. What are those about?
That's true. While the persecution is widely condemned, some aspects of Falun Gong itself draw criticism, often related to doctrine, leadership, and associated activities.
Like what specifically?
Some statements by Li Hongzhi on social issues like interracial marriage or homosexuality, and on things like aliens or apocalyptic ideas, are seen by critics as quite dogmatic or out of step.
And the way Li Hongzhi himself is viewed.
The level of reverence can seem extreme to outsiders. His writings being treated as infallible scripture raises concerns about internal dissent or critical thinking within the movement.
We touched on the medical issue earlier, too.
Yes, the stance discouraging reliance on conventional medicine remains a significant point of criticism from health professionals.
And the Epoch Times, their main media outlet, has faced scrutiny recently.
It has, particularly in the U.S. political context. It's been criticized for aligning closely with certain political figures and promoting narratives sometimes viewed as conspiratorial or far-right.
Which complicates their image.
It can, yeah. It potentially undermines their claims of simply being a persecuted spiritual group, blurring lines with specific political agendas, at least in the perception of some.
Also, the intensity of the anti-CCP rhetoric.
Some observers find the rhetoric and imagery used by affiliated groups to be very militant, sometimes using language that mirrors propaganda itself.
But the consensus remains that none of this justifies persecution.
Absolutely. Human rights groups are very clear on that. Criticisms of doctrine or media strategy don't excuse torture, imprisonment, or forced organ harvesting. The human rights abuses are the central issue.
So, summing up, where does Falun Gong stand today? What's its current status and legacy?
It's in this really strange, paradoxical position. In China, banned, underground, heavily persecuted, practitioners risk everything to maintain their faith.
Still actively suppressed.
Definitely. The ban remains, censorship is tight, arrests continue. The CCP still views it as a major threat.
But outside China.
It's a very visible, persistent global movement. It didn't just survive the crackdown, it adapted and built this transnational network for advocacy, media, and cultural outreach.
Has it had a broader impact beyond its own followers?
I think so, yes. It significantly shaped how the world sees the CCP's approach to control, censorship, and repression.
How so?
The sheer scale and brutality of the campaign against Falun Gong, especially the organ harvesting allegations, became a major lens through which people viewed the regime's human rights record.
Did it pave the way for understanding other crackdowns, like in Xinjiang?
Arguably, yes. Yeah. The patterns of demonization, mass detention, forced assimilation, using technology for surveillance, many tactics used against Falun Gong were later seen applied to Uyghurs and other groups.
So its legacy is complex.
Very. It's a story of faith, resilience, nonviolent resistance against overwhelming state power. But also a case study in diaspora activism, media strategies, and the controversies that can arise.
It really highlights that clash between individual belief and authoritarian control.
Precisely. And how, in our connected world, a domestic crackdown can become a lasting international issue, with voices finding ways to be heard despite immense obstacles.
So looking back, Falun Gong's path from this popular Qigong-based practice to a major global human rights symbol is quite extraordinary. We've traced its explosive growth, the party's violent reaction, and its unexpected resilience and transformation in exile.
And thinking about this whole story, it really does leave you with some big questions, doesn't it? For you, the learner, consider what Falun Gong's experience shows about the limits or maybe the persistence of state power over personal belief, especially now with global communication.
Yeah, and also that tough question for democratic societies.
Yeah.
How do you balance engaging economically with the country while also addressing meaningfully really severe human rights abuses like those documented here? It's a constant tension.
It really is. This deep dive is just a starting point, of course. There's so much more detail and nuance.
Absolutely. We definitely encourage you to dig deeper into the sources, explore the different perspectives. It's a story that's still unfolding and remains incredibly significant.